It is Halloween night, 2019. A group of men are standing in a field in rural Georgia. They have stolen a goat. They have drawn a circle around it. One of them produces a blade. Another produces a sheet of LSD. A cup is passed around. The men drink from it. The cup contains the blood of the goat. These men are not a cult in the conventional sense. They have no spiritual leader. They have no ancient text. What they have is a plan for the violent collapse of American society, the assassination of political opponents, the systematic targeting of Black Americans, Jewish Americans, and anyone they have decided is a traitor to their race. They call the plan the Boogaloo. They call their organization the Base. Standing in that circle, holding the legs of a dying goat, is a man who has no intention of drinking the blood. He has been here before, not this field, not this ritual, but this particular dark edge of the American interior. He has spent 17 years navigating it. He knows the language. He knows the rituals. He knows how to make men like these believe he is one of them. His name is Scott Payne. He is an FBI undercover agent. And what he has seen across 17 years, 3 major infiltrations, and the full arc of American white extremism from the dying days of the KKK to the birth of something far more dangerous, is a story that the United States has not yet finished reckoning with. This is not a story about a brave agent who stopped bad people. This is a story about what those bad people revealed about the country that produced them, and why what Scott Payne found at the end of his career was far more alarming than anything he encountered at the beginning. To understand what Scott Payne could do, you first have to understand what he was. He was not a product of elite law enforcement. He did not come from a family with connections to federal agencies. He grew up in the American South, working class, rural, comfortable in spaces that most FBI agents would enter only with considerable anxiety. He was 6'4". He weighed 260 pounds. He was covered in tattoos. His nickname was Big Country. When Payne joined the FBI in 1998, his profile did not suggest a natural fit for the agency's more sophisticated operations. He had no foreign language skills. He did not have an advanced degree. The kinds of undercover work that got the most institutional prestige, organized crime infiltrations, financial fraud investigations, international counterterrorism, were built around operatives who could move convincingly in boardrooms, in embassy parties, in the upper registers of criminal enterprise. Payne could not do any of that. What he could do was something rarer and, it turned out, more valuable. He could walk into a biker bar in rural Massachusetts and within 20 minutes have a stranger buying him drinks and calling him a friend. He could adopt the cadences, the posture, the casual violence of language that marks membership in subcultures that treat outsiders as enemies by default. He did not need to perform this. He understood it from the inside. The FBI undercover training program, a 2-week intensive at Quantico with no days off, built around sleep deprivation and high-pressure role play, confirmed what his supervisors had suspected. Payne did not just pass. He thrived under conditions that broke other candidates. By 2002, he was certified. By 2004, he was already developing a reputation that would follow him for the rest of his career, the redneck who went where other agents could not and came back with evidence that prosecutors could use. His first major assignment was the Outlaws Motorcycle Club. What he found there prepared him for everything that followed. And what followed was significantly worse. The hardest part of undercover work is not the danger. The danger is real. There are moments in every long-term infiltration when the operative's life depends on a word said correctly, a reaction held in check, a piece of equipment hidden precisely enough. But danger is manageable. It is acute. It has a beginning and an end. The hardest part is the relationship. Over 18 months with the Outlaws Motorcycle Club, Payne built genuine friendships with the men he was investigating. Not performed friendships, not the tactical simulation of warmth designed to extract intelligence. Real ones, the kind that are built on shared experience, mutual trust, and the particular intimacy of people who have seen each other at their worst and stayed. There was a man named Scott Town, road captain of the Massachusetts chapter. They were the same size, had the same disposition, had daughters the same age. They drank together, fought alongside each other, completed each other's sentences. Scott Town told Payne he was one of the few people he would take a bullet for. Payne testified against him. Scott Town was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. The last words they spoke to each other, just before the SWAT team hit Town's house, were, "I love you, brother." This is the psychological architecture of deep undercover work that is almost never discussed in the public accounts. The agent is not simply pretending to be a friend. In many cases, the agent becomes a friend, a genuine one, inside a false identity, and then destroys the person the friendship was built with. Payne carried this weight into every subsequent infiltration, including the one that would take him somewhere the motorcycle gangs, for all their violence, had never gone. What the Outlaws case established, beyond the convictions, beyond the years of sentences handed down in federal courts, was a template for how Payne would operate in every subsequent infiltration. Build the relationship first, make it real, earn the kind of trust that only comes from shared experience, from loyalty demonstrated under pressure, from the particular bond that forms between people who have faced danger together, and then use it. The ethical weight of this is not something the FBI's training program can fully prepare an agent for. There are courses on managing the psychological stress of undercover work. There are protocols for maintaining the boundary between the operative identity and the real one. But there is no protocol for the specific grief of genuinely caring about someone and then watching a SWAT team take them down in a driveway while you stand 10 feet away, having arranged the moment. Payne carried this forward. It would compound assignment by assignment for 17 years. When Scott Payne infiltrated a chapter of the Ku Klux Klan in 2017, the organization was a shadow of what it had once been. At its peak in the 1920s, the KKK had claimed between 3 and 6 million members across the United States. It was not fringe. It was mainstream, embedded in local politics, law enforcement, and civic life across large portions of the country. Senators belonged to it. Governors belonged to it. Judges belonged to it. Its influence on American political and legal history extends far beyond the violence of its night riders and its burning crosses. By 2017, the KKK had somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 members, a fraction of its former strength. It operated in small cells, conducted ceremonies in remote fields, and maintained a hotline, a literal telephone line for recruitment. Payne called the hotline. What he found was an organization that was ideologically consistent with its history, virulently racist, anti-Semitic, committed to the fantasy of white supremacy, but operationally diminished. The men he met were aging. Their ceremonies were elaborate, but their capacity for coordinated violence was limited. The KKK of 2017 was dangerous in the way that a deteriorating structure is dangerous, capable of causing harm, but not capable of causing the kind of harm that reshapes the world around it. What concerned Payne, and what concerned the analysts at the FBI who were tracking the broader landscape of domestic extremism, was not the KKK. It was what was growing in its shadow. A new generation of white extremists had looked at the KKK and found it inadequate, too nostalgic, too slow, too bound by the rituals of a movement that had already lost. But before Payne could see what was replacing it, he had to understand what it was replacing. And to understand the Klan in 2017 was to understand something that the organization's enemies and defenders both tended to miss. Rituals were not incidental, they were the point. Payne was naturalized into the United Klans of America in a field at night, blindfolded, one hand on the shoulder of the man in front of him. A figure in a green robe touched a sword to his shoulder. He repeated an oath. When the blindfold was removed, there were embraces, small celebrations, the particular warmth of men who believe they have accepted a new brother. Payne described the realization that hit him walking back to his truck. He had joined the Klan, accidentally, almost. The ceremony had simply happened around him while he was there. What the ceremony revealed was the Klan's fundamental weakness in the modern era. Its power had always been social. The power of belonging, of brotherhood, of a community organized around shared identity and shared grievance. When that community shrank, the power shrank with it. You cannot terrorize a country from a field in Alabama with 8 members and a hotline. The ideology has a name: accelerationism. The belief that the existing social order is so irreparably corrupt that the only productive strategy is to accelerate its collapse, to commit acts of violence so destabilizing that they trigger the breakdown of the state, creating the chaos from which a new, racially pure order can emerge. The logic is not new. Versions of it appear throughout the history of revolutionary violence, on both the far left and the far right. What was new in the decade after 2015 was the infrastructure, the online networks, the encrypted communication channels, the international connectivity that allowed small cells of committed accelerationists to organize, train, and radicalize across borders without ever meeting in person. The accelerationists had saints. Dylan Roof, who killed 9 Black Americans in a Charleston church in 2015, was Saint Roof. Brenton Tarrant, who killed 51 people at 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand in 2019, was Saint Tarrant. These men were not failures or aberrations. They were models, templates for action, proof that it was possible. In 2018, a man named Ronaldo Nazaro, an American living in St. Petersburg, Russia, who had worked as a contractor for the Department of Justice, founded a network called The Base. Its explicit purpose was the preparation of members for what accelerationists called total collapse, including guerrilla warfare, assassinations, infrastructure sabotage, and acts of mass violence designed to trigger the boogaloo. In July 2019, Scott Payne sent The Base an email. What he had done to get to that email, the months of building an online presence on platforms that tolerated far-right content, the careful construction of a digital identity that would pass the scrutiny of men who were specifically trained to detect infiltrators, represented a different kind of undercover work than anything in his earlier career. The KKK had a hotline. The base had an operational security protocol developed by someone with actual intelligence training. The founder of the base, Ronaldo Nazzaro, operating under the pseudonyms Norman Spear and Roman Wolf, had worked as a contractor in Iraq for the Department of Justice. He understood from professional experience how intelligence operations worked. He had designed the base's vetting process specifically to detect law enforcement infiltration. He required members to operate through encrypted channels. He staged the in-person meetings at locations of his own choosing, with counter-surveillance measures in place. He was, in other words, running the organization the way an intelligence professional would, because that is what he was. The vetting process for the base was more sophisticated than anything Payne had encountered with the Outlaws or the KKK. It began online, a series of exchanges on encrypted platforms, background questions about ideology and affiliations, and military experience. A phone interview that lasted 1 hour. The men on the other end of the process were not simply screening for commitment. They were screening for competence. The base wanted members who could fight, who had weapons training, who understood operational security. Payne passed every stage. The final test was in person. In August 2019, at an abandoned concrete plant outside Rome, Georgia, the Georgia cell of the base arrived armed. They produced a wand, an electronic detection device for surveillance equipment, and swept Payne and his truck. The device began alarming near the rear of the truck. The tracking device planted by Payne's case team was triggering it. One of the cell members suggested the signal was coming from nearby power lines. They moved to a different location. Payne, on a call with his case team, told them to deactivate the tracker immediately. His team hesitated because if the tracker went dark, they would lose the ability to locate him. Payne told them, "If you don't shut it off, this operation ends in the next 5 minutes." They shut it off. At the new location, the wand found nothing. Payne was in. Over the following months, he attended training camps, extended paramilitary sessions in remote locations where members practiced hand-to-hand combat, weapons drills, and the kind of tactical exercises that have a specific purpose, preparing people to kill other people and disappear without leaving evidence. He attended the Halloween camp. He held the legs of the goat. He watched men take LSD, drink blood from a cup, and burn American flags and Bibles while screaming about the death of everyone they had decided was their enemy. In the weeks that followed, the cell leader began bringing him into the planning of something specific. Not a training exercise, not a ceremony, a murder. The target was an Antifa couple in the Georgia area. The plan was specific: enter the house at night, kill everyone inside, and set the house on fire. Roles were assigned. Payne was designated to enter with the cell leader. Another member would cover the exits. A fourth would set the fire. The planning went further than the assignment of roles. They discussed DNA evidence, taping clothing to skin, and applying Vaseline to facial hair to prevent shedding. They discussed bladder control. The cell leader had read that first-time killers sometimes lost control of their bodily functions under the stress of taking a life. He suggested adult diapers as a precaution. One of the younger members asked if he could be the one to fire the fatal shot. He described it as popping his cherry. These were not abstractions. They were young men, some barely out of their teens, sitting in a room in rural Georgia, making logistical plans for the murder of specific people whose address they had already identified. The specific banality of it, the matter-of-fact discussion of diapers and DNA and who would hold the gun, was, in some ways, more disturbing than the ideology itself. Simultaneously, the Baltimore cell of the base was planning something larger. They had identified a pro-gun rally in Virginia, a gathering that would bring together militia members, law enforcement, and protesters, and were planning to fire into the crowd. The goal was to make it appear that no one knew who was shooting at whom. To ignite, in a single afternoon, the beginning of the race war they had been preparing for. The rally was scheduled for January 20th, 2020. The takedown was coordinated across multiple states in the weeks before the Virginia rally. Payne was in Rome, Georgia, on the day his cell leader was arrested. He had arranged to take the man to lunch. They pulled out of the neighborhood. Payne told him he thought something was wrong with the truck. A vehicle pulled alongside them, members of the case team posing as bystanders. As Payne stepped out and walked to the rear of the truck, a SWAT vehicle came over the hill. The cell leader was still looking at Payne when the arrest team moved in. In the days that followed, SWAT teams arrested the remaining members of the Georgia cell and the Baltimore cell. Luke Lane, the cell leader Payne had driven to lunch, was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison. Jacob Kaderli received 13 years. Patrick Matthews and Brian Lemley, the Baltimore cell members who had planned the rally shooting, each received 9 years. Ronaldo Nazaro, the founder of the base, remains in St. Petersburg, Russia. He has not been extradited. As of the most recent public reporting, the base is experiencing a resurgence and is still recruiting. Scott Payne retired from the FBI in June 2021. There is a question that Scott Payne's career forces into view, a question that is easier to avoid than to answer. When he infiltrated the Ku Klux Klan in 2017, he found an organization in terminal decline. Aging membership, diminished capacity, a movement that had lost so much of its institutional power that its recruitment strategy involved a telephone hotline. 2 years later, he was inside an organization whose members were planning coordinated mass murder, preparing for guerrilla warfare, and operating across international borders with a level of tactical sophistication that the Ku Klux Klan at its peak had never approached. The question is, what happened in between? The answer is not simple, and it is not comfortable. The decline of legacy. Hate groups like the Ku Klux Klan did not mean the decline of white extremism in America. It meant its transformation from an institutional model built around membership, ceremony, and public presence to a cell-based model built around anonymity, operational security, and the kind of decentralized violence that is significantly harder for law enforcement to detect and prevent. The Ku Klux Klan burned crosses in public. The base planned murders in encrypted chat rooms. One of those is more visible, the other is more dangerous. Payne spent 17 years inside this evolution. He watched the transition in real time, from the motorcycle gangs of the early 2000s to the ceremonial racism of the Ku Klux Klan, to the tactical paramilitary cells of the accelerationist movement. Each step represented not a worsening of ideology, but a refinement of method. The hatred was constant. What changed was the capability. At his retirement ceremony in June 2021, June 30th was named Scott Payne Day in his county. The rally in Virginia, the one Payne's operation prevented, was followed by January 6th, 2021, by Charlottesville, and by a series of events that suggest the impulse the accelerationists were trying to ignite did not require their ignition. Scott Payne spent 17 years preventing specific acts of violence. What he could not prevent was the condition that kept producing them. This is the hardest part of the story to hold. The arrests feel like resolution, the bad actors identified, prosecuted, sentenced, the threat neutralized. But the men Payne put in prison were not the source of the threat. They were symptoms of it. For every cell that was dismantled, the infrastructure that radicalized its members remained intact. The websites, the forums, the encrypted channels, the ideology itself, the specific, carefully articulated argument that American society is irredeemable and that violence is the only honest response, continued to circulate, to find new audiences, to convert new members. The U.S. Director of National Intelligence in 2021 identified racially motivated violent extremists as the most lethal domestic terrorism threat facing the United States. Not foreign terrorism, domestic. The threat that Scott Payne had been documenting from the inside for nearly 2 decades became, by the time he retired, the primary concern of the agencies he had served. He retired in June 2021. 5 months earlier, on January 6, 2021, a mob had attacked the United States Capitol. The boogaloo the accelerationists had been preparing for did not require the base to trigger it. Scott Payne spent 17 years preventing specific acts of violence. What he could not prevent was the country that kept making them necessary.